What if I told you that some of the most important moments in American history happened on a Tuesday afternoon, got signed with barely a photographer present, and never made it past page 17 of the newspaper? While everyone was paying attention to the dramatic speeches and the grand ceremonies, quiet decisions were being made in committee rooms and budget offices that would reshape the entire country. A fraction written into a compromise, a funding clause buried in an appropriations bill, an executive memo issued on a Friday before a holiday weekend. These weren't accidents. This was how power actually worked, not through the moments everyone remembers, but through the details nobody noticed until decades later, when it was way too late to do anything about it. So if you're ready, get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket, turn the lights down, because over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 40 decisions made quietly in Washington that still shape America today, from the fractions that determine congressional power to the budget riders that define rights, from the executive memos that protected people to the court rulings that changed everything. Starting with a mathematical compromise that echoed for nearly 80 years, the 3/5 compromise. So here's the thing about math in 1787. Sometimes the numbers you choose echo for centuries, and sometimes they're just deeply uncomfortable to talk about at dinner parties. The 3/5 compromise was one of those quiet decisions that shaped American power dynamics for nearly 80 years, and most people today couldn't tell you what it actually meant if you asked them between yawns. Picture this. You're at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It's summer, there's no air conditioning, everyone's wearing wool, and you're trying to figure out how to count people for congressional representation. Except, the southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation purposes, which would give them more seats in Congress, but obviously had no intention of letting those same people vote or, be free. The northern states saw this for exactly what it was, a way to inflate southern political power. So they compromised. And by compromised, I mean they did that very American thing where you split the difference on a moral question and pretend it's pragmatism. Every 5 enslaved individuals would count as 3 people for representation and taxation purposes. Not half, not a quarter, but 3/5. Because apparently someone did the political calculus and decided that fraction would keep enough delegates in the room to finish writing the Constitution. The practical effect? Southern states got significantly more representatives in Congress than their free populations alone would have warranted. This mathematical sleight of hand gave the South outsized influence in presidential elections too, since electoral votes were tied to congressional representation. It's why so many early presidents were Southern slaveholders. They had a built-in advantage coded right into the document everyone claimed was about equality. This quiet arrangement lasted until the Civil War finally blew it apart. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th redefined citizenship and representation. And the 3/5 compromise became a footnote, though a really important one in constitutional history. But for 78 years, this single fraction quietly tilted the entire balance of American political power, shaping everything from westward expansion to the Supreme Court. And, speaking of quiet decisions about expansion, there was this one time a president decided to just double the size of the country without asking too many questions. The Louisiana Purchase Authorization. Thomas Jefferson had a problem in 1803, and like many problems involving Jefferson, it came down to principles versus practicality. See, Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government could only do things explicitly written in the Constitution. Noble stance. Very principled. Except France just offered to sell us Louisiana, which was roughly 827,000 square miles of territory, and nowhere in the Constitution does it say the president can impulse buy half a continent. Napoleon needed cash for his European wars and had basically given up on his North American empire dreams after losing Haiti. So, he offered the whole Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, which even by 1803 standards was an absolutely ridiculous deal. Jefferson's envoys were in Paris trying to buy just New Orleans for port access, and suddenly France was like, how about everything from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains? It was the real estate equivalent of going to buy a used car and the dealer offering you the entire dealership. Jefferson was torn. His political philosophy said this was unconstitutional overreach. His practical side said this was possibly the greatest land deal in human history, and he'd be an absolute fool to pass it up. So he did what many of us do when faced with cognitive dissonance. He rationalized it, held his nose, and did it anyway. He quietly submitted the treaty to the Senate. They ratified it, and just like that, America doubled in size through what was essentially an executive real estate transaction. No constitutional amendment, no lengthy debate about whether the federal government had this power, just a quick Senate vote, and suddenly the United States owned Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and parts of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, New Mexico, Texas, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. The entire future of westward expansion, manifest destiny, and American continental power flowed from this one quiet authorization. Jefferson worried about it for the rest of his life. But he'd set a precedent. Sometimes you can just do things. Presidential power, it turned out, was partly about what you could get away with, and that precedent would echo through every expansion. But of course, buying all that territory created a new question. What would you do with it? The Missouri Compromise Line. Let me tell you about an imaginary line drawn across a map in 1820 that postponed a war for 30 years. The Missouri Compromise Line sat at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, and it was the kind of legislative duct tape that everyone knew was temporary, but nobody wanted to admit it out loud. Here's what happened. Missouri wanted to become a state in 1819. Simple enough, except Missouri wanted to be a slave state, and that would tip the careful balance in the Senate between free and slave states. The North said no. The South said yes. Congress spent months in the kind of debate that made everyone exhausted just watching it. The type where you could feel the constitutional crisis brewing like a thunderstorm. Henry Clay, who loved a good compromise the way some people love a good sandwich, brokered a deal. Missouri could be a slave state, but Maine would split from Massachusetts and enter as a free state, keeping the balance. More importantly, and this is the part that quietly shaped everything, slavery would be prohibited in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of that 36-30 line, except for Missouri itself. Below the line, still up for debate. Above it, theoretically, free. This invisible geographical rule became the framework for how America argued about expansion for 3 decades. Every time a new territory wanted statehood, politicians would check the map, see which side of the line it fell on, and proceed accordingly. It was the political equivalent of agreeing not to talk about certain things at Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone knew the underlying issue wasn't resolved, but at least you could get through the meal. The compromise worked until it didn't. By 1850, California wanted in as a free state, and it didn't fit the formula. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 basically said, forget the line, let territories decide for themselves, which led to literal violence in Kansas. By 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declared the line had been unconstitutional all along, and by 1861, the whole system collapsed into the Civil War that everyone had been quietly dreading since 1820. But for 30 years, that line held. It was a masterclass in kicking the can down the road, and sometimes that's exactly what governance looks like, buying time and hoping future generations figure out better answers. Of course, not all quiet decisions were about lines on maps. Some were about moving people across them. The Indian Removal Act funding. In 1830, Congress did something quietly devastating. They appropriated $500,000 to relocate Native American tribes from the Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. That sounds bureaucratic, doesn't it? Just numbers and appropriations and policy language. But that funding set in motion what would become known as the Trail of Tears, and there's no gentle way to talk about what happened next. Andrew Jackson had wanted this for years. He'd fought against Creek and Seminole tribes as a general, And as president, he saw Native Americans as obstacles to American expansion and settlement. The Indian Removal Act passed Congress narrowly. The House vote was just 97 to 97 before the deciding vote, but once it passed, Jackson had legal authorization and funding to negotiate removal treaties with tribes in the Southeast. Here's the thing that makes this particularly grim. The Supreme Court actually sided with the Cherokee Nation in 1832. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands and that the federal government had to honor its treaties. It was a clear legal victory for the Cherokee. Jackson's response, according to historical accounts, was essentially, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The Supreme Court had no enforcement mechanism, and Jackson had funding from Congress. What followed was forced relocation. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes, called the Five Civilized Tribes, because they'd adopted many European American customs, as if that should have mattered, were compelled to leave their ancestral lands. Thousands died during the journey west from exposure, disease, and starvation. The Cherokee removal alone, in 1838 and 39, killed an estimated 4,000 people out of 15,000 who were forced to march. That initial appropriation, that quiet congressional funding decision, made it all administratively possible. It provided the budget for the logistics, the military escorts. Sometimes the most devastating decisions are the ones that look like simple budget items, passed without much fanfare, and implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. And speaking of Jackson's economic decisions that had lasting consequences, there was this executive order about currency that went about as well as you'd expect, the specie circular. Andrew Jackson didn't trust paper money. Actually, that's underselling it. Jackson hated paper money, the way some people hate mosquitoes or waiting in line at the DMV. So in 1836, he issued something called the specie circular, an executive order that quietly triggered an economic crisis that would define his successor's entire presidency. Here's the context. Land speculation was out of control. The federal government was selling Western land, and people were buying it with paper money issued by state banks, which were printing currency like they were running a particularly enthusiastic art project. Jackson, who associated paper currency with corruption and instability, decided enough was enough. The specie circular declared that public land could only be purchased with gold or silver specie, in the terminology of the time, except for small parcels, where actual settlers could still use paper for purchases under a certain amount. On paper, irony intended, it seemed reasonable. Stop speculation, require real currency, stabilize the land market. In practice, it was like pulling the emergency brake on a train going full speed. Banks scrambled to collect gold and silver. Credit contracted. Land sales plummeted. The circular went into effect in August of 1836, and by spring of 1837, right as Martin Van Buren was settling into his new presidency, the entire economy was imploding. The Panic of 1837 became one of the worst economic depressions in American history up to that point. Banks failed, unemployment soared, businesses collapsed. Van Buren, who'd been Jackson's vice president and had inherited both his policies and his problems, spent his entire term dealing with the economic aftermath. It didn't help that Van Buren largely agreed with Jackson's hard money philosophy and refused to do much to intervene, believing the economy should correct itself. Jackson issued his circular using executive authority without congressional approval. It was the kind of unilateral presidential action that would become more common over time. But in 1836, it was still relatively novel. One man, one decision, transmitted through the bureaucracy, quietly reshaping economic policy and triggering a depression that lasted years. The specie circular was eventually repealed by Congress in 1840. But the damage was done. It stood as a reminder that executive orders, even about seemingly technical matters like currency requirements, can have enormous ripple effects. But while Jackson was making dubious economic decisions, another president would soon make one that actually worked out quite well. The Homestead Act signing. Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act on May 20th, 1862, while the Civil War was tearing the country apart, and somehow this quiet piece of legislation about giving away free land ended up shaping the American West more than almost anything else. It's the kind of policy that sounds too simple to be true. Show up, claim 160 acres, farm it for 5 years, and it's yours. Free. Just like that. The idea had been floating around Congress for years, but Southern representatives kept blocking it. They worried that free land out west would mean new free states, tipping the political balance against slavery. Once the Southern states seceded and their congressional delegations left, Republicans suddenly had the votes to pass it. Lincoln signed it. And just like that, the government started giving away public land, or more accurately, land that had been taken from Native Americans to anyone willing to settle it. The requirements were straightforward. You had to be 21 years old, or the head of a household. You had to be a citizen, or intend to become one. And you couldn't have borne arms against the United States. You'd file a claim, pay a small filing fee, build a dwelling, and cultivate the land. After 5 years of continuous residence, you could file for a patent and the land was yours. Alternatively, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre after just 6 months. Between 1862 and 1934, when the act was repealed, the government granted about 270 million acres to homesteaders, roughly 10% of all land in the United States. That's an area larger than California and Texas combined, redistributed to families willing to work it. It pulled settlement westward, created new agricultural communities, and fundamentally reshaped American land ownership patterns. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The 160-acre plots were sized for eastern farming conditions, not the arid West where you needed way more land for ranching. Many homesteaders failed. The government estimated only about 40% of claims resulted in patents. Women could file claims if they were unmarried or heads of households, which was progressive for the time, though in practice, most homesteaders were men. And the whole thing was built on the displacement of Native Americans, which we've already discussed wasn't exactly America's finest moment. But as quiet policy decisions go, the Homestead Act was transformative. Lincoln signed it between battles and barely mentioned it in his speeches, yet it populated the West and created the iconic American image of the independent farmer on their own land. And speaking of transformative policies that came out of the Civil War era, there was this amendment that quietly redefined American citizenship, the 14th Amendment Enforcement Strategy. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1868, and while everyone focuses on its citizenship and equal protection clauses, which are genuinely important, there's this fascinating enforcement strategy that Congress used that hardly anyone talks about. They basically held Southern states hostage until they ratified it, and in doing so, they established a precedent for how the federal government could enforce constitutional change. Here's what happened. After the Civil War, Congress was trying to figure out how to reconstruct the South and protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. The 14th Amendment was their answer. It defined citizenship to include everyone born in the United States, regardless of race, guaranteed due process and equal protection under the law, and addressed some technical issues about Confederate debt and representation. But amendments need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And Southern states weren't exactly enthusiastic about ratifying something that would protect the rights of Black Americans. So Congress got creative. As part of the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, they required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment as a condition for readmission to the Union and restoration of congressional representation. No ratification, no representation. It was political hardball, disguised as constitutional process, and it worked. One by one, Southern states held conventions, ratified the amendment, and were readmitted. By July 9th, 1868, enough states had ratified it that Secretary of State William Seward declared it part of the Constitution. The enforcement strategy had succeeded in fundamentally altering American constitutional law, even though several Southern states later tried to rescind their ratifications attempts that went nowhere because by then, The amendment was already in effect. This quiet congressional strategy established something important. The federal government could impose conditions on states as part of Reconstruction. It set a precedent for federal power over state governments that would echo through civil rights enforcement for the next century and beyond. Every time the federal government threatened to withhold funding or imposed requirements on states, it was following a playbook that started with Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment. The amendment itself reshaped American citizenship, making birthright citizenship the law of the land and providing the constitutional foundation for civil rights protections that wouldn't be fully enforced for another century. But it was that enforcement strategy, that quiet congressional decision to leverage readmission, that actually made ratification possible. Of course, enforcing equal rights was one thing. Reforming how government itself worked was another challenge entirely, one that would take a presidential assassination to finally address. The Pendleton Civil Service Act. Sometimes it takes a murder to reform a government hiring system, which is a grim way to start a bedtime story, but here we are. The Pendleton Civil Service Act was signed into law by Chester Arthur in January of 1883, and it quietly ended the spoils system that had defined American political patronage for decades. And it only happened because a disappointed office seeker shot President James Garfield. The spoils system, to the victor go the spoils, meant that when a new president took office, they could fire federal employees and replace them with political supporters. It was patronage on a massive scale. Every post office, customs house, and federal position was potentially up for grabs based on political loyalty rather than competence. Office seekers would swarm Washington after each election, demanding jobs they felt they'd earned by supporting the winning candidate. Charles Guiteau was one of those office seekers. He'd supported Garfield's campaign, wrote a speech that basically nobody heard, and convinced himself he deserved to be ambassador to France. When he didn't get the job, shocking, I know he decided Garfield needed to be removed. On July 2nd, 1881, Guiteau shot Garfield at a train station. Garfield lingered for months before dying in September, and Guiteau's defense at trial was that he was merely an instrument of divine will, removing an obstacle to political change. The assassination horrified the nation and created momentum for civil service reform. Chester Arthur, who became president and had actually benefited from the spoils system himself as collector of the Port of New York, surprised everyone by supporting reform. The Pendleton Act established the Civil Service Commission, created competitive examinations for federal positions, and made it illegal to fire someone for political reasons or to require federal employees to make political contributions. Initially, the act only covered about 10% of federal positions, but presidents gradually expanded it. By the 1930s, about 80% of federal jobs were under civil service protection. Today, that system of merit-based hiring is so ingrained in how government works that we barely think about it. But it represented a massive shift from political patronage to professional bureaucracy. The Pendleton Act didn't eliminate politics from government, nothing could, but it quietly professionalized the federal workforce and made government somewhat more stable and competent. One assassination, one reform act, and American governance shifted towards something resembling a modern bureaucracy. But while the civil service was being reformed, there was still the question of what kind of money Americans would use. The Gold Standard Act. William McKinley signed the Gold Standard Act on March 14th, 1900, and in doing so, he quietly ended decades of argument about monetary policy while setting up the financial framework that would define much of the 20th century. It's one of those decisions that sounds incredibly boring until you realize it shaped everything from the Great Depression to modern central banking. Here's the context. For most of the late 1800s, Americans argued intensely about whether currency should be backed by gold, silver, or both. Farmers and debtors generally supported silver, having more currency in circulation meant inflation, which made debts easier to pay. Creditors and Eastern financial interests supported gold, which kept currency scarce and valuable. This wasn't abstract economic theory. It was about whose interests government would serve. The debate got really intense in the 1890s. William Jennings Bryan gave his famous Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention, declaring, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, and advocating for the free coinage of silver. McKinley, the Republican candidate, represented the gold standard position. McKinley won, partly because Eastern business interests funded his campaign heavily, partly because the discovery of new gold deposits eased some of the currency shortage concerns. By 1900, the question was basically settled politically, and the Gold Standard Act made it official. It declared that the gold dollar would be the standard unit of value. It set the dollar's value at 25 and 8/10 grains of gold, and it created a reserve fund to maintain gold convertibility. Paper money could be redeemed for gold on demand. The government was now committed to maintaining a fixed exchange rate between dollars and gold. This had enormous implications. It meant the money supply was limited by how much gold the government held. It meant international exchange rates were stable, other countries were on gold standards too, so currencies had fixed values relative to each other. It meant the government couldn't just print money to solve economic problems. The whole system was designed for stability and predictability, which creditors loved and which constrained economic policy in ways that would become really problematic during the Great Depression. The Gold Standard Act stayed in effect, with modifications, until 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt suspended gold convertibility during the Depression. Later, the Bretton Woods system created a modified gold standard after World War II, which lasted until Richard Nixon ended gold convertibility entirely in 1971. But for decades, McKinley's quiet signing of that act defined American monetary policy. And speaking of quietly creating financial systems that would define the future, there was this one Christmas signing that changed everything. The Federal Reserve Act, Christmas signing. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, creating the central banking system that still controls American monetary policy today, and he did it quietly during the holiday week, when most Americans were thinking about anything but banking reform. It's the kind of timing that makes you wonder if they planned it that way. The United States had resisted central banking for most of its history. The first and second banks of the United States both died after their charters expired, partly because Americans associated central banks with European-style financial control, and partly because Andrew Jackson really hated them. Morgan basically had to personally bail out the American financial system because there was no central bank to do it. Even skeptics admitted something had to change. A congressional commission spent years studying European central banks and debating various proposals. The result was the Federal Reserve Act, which created not a single central bank but a system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, coordinated by a Federal Reserve Board in Washington. It was a compromise between those who wanted centralized control and those who feared it, very American, spreading power across regions while still creating a coordinated system. The Federal Reserve got several key powers. It could issue currency Federal Reserve notes, which are the dollar bills you use today, set reserve requirements for banks, provide liquidity during financial panics by lending to banks, and influence interest rates through what would eventually become open market operations. Basically, it became the lender of last resort and the primary tool for managing the money supply. Wilson signed it right before Christmas, Congress went home for the holidays, and most Americans probably didn't pay much attention. But that quiet signing created an institution that would shape every economic boom and bust for the next century. The Federal Reserve would manage the Depression arguably badly at first, fight inflation in the 1980s, respond to the 2008 financial crisis, and handle COVID-era monetary policy. Every time you hear about interest rate decisions or quantitative easing or monetary policy, you're seeing the legacy of that 1913 Christmas signing. The Fed, as it's called now, has been controversial throughout its existence. Some love it, some think it should be abolished, some think it's part of various conspiracy theories, but it's been there quietly managing monetary policy for over 100 years now, which is longer than most government institutions last, and that, right there, is how you quietly create something that lasts. The 17th Amendment ratification. The same year Wilson was creating the Federal Reserve, another quiet change was happening to American democracy that most people barely noticed. The 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and it fundamentally altered how the Senate worked by making senators directly elected by voters instead of chosen by state legislatures. It's one of those reforms that seems obvious now, but was actually pretty controversial at the time. Originally, the Constitution said state legislatures would choose senators. The founders thought this would make the Senate a more deliberative, less populist body, a sort of cooling saucer for the hot tea of the House of Representatives, as one founder supposedly put it. But by the early 1900s, this system was creating problems. State legislatures were deadlocked, leaving Senate seats vacant for months. Corruption was rampant, with wealthy interests essentially buying Senate seats by bribing state legislators. Progressives pushed for direct election, arguing it would reduce corruption and make senators more accountable to actual voters. Some states even held non-binding popular votes for Senate and pressured their legislatures to follow the results. It was democracy trying to happen despite the system, which is very American when you think about it. By 1912, so many states were using some form of popular election that Congress finally passed the amendment, and it was ratified remarkably quickly, less than a year. The 17th Amendment changed the first paragraph of Article 1, Section 3, establishing that senators would be elected by the people of each state for 6-year terms. It kept the 2 senators per state structure, but democratized how they got there. Suddenly, senators had to campaign, appeal to voters, and worry about public opinion in ways they hadn't before. Critics argued it made the Senate too responsive to popular whims and removed a key check on democracy. Supporters said it finally made senators accountable. What definitely happened is that Senate campaigns became more expensive, more public, and more influenced by the same forces that shaped House races. The Senate became slightly less of an exclusive club and slightly more of a democratic institution, though how much is debatable. The amendment passed without much fanfare, overshadowed by other progressive-era reforms, but it quietly shifted the balance of American democracy, making the upper chamber answerable to voters rather than political machines. Every Senate race you've ever watched, every campaign ad you've suffered through, every debate about Senate candidates, that all flows from this 1913 ratification that barely made headlines. But while Americans were democratizing their own Senate, they were making very different decisions about territories and citizenship elsewhere. The Jones Act Citizenship Clause. Woodrow Wilson signed the Jones-Shafroth Act on March 2, 1917, and buried in its provisions was a citizenship clause that quietly determined Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States for the next century and counting. The timing wasn't exactly coincidental. America was about to enter World War I and needed soldiers, and Puerto Ricans would now be eligible for the draft. Puerto Rico had been a U.S. territory since 1898, taken from Spain after the Spanish-American War. For nearly 2 decades, Puerto Ricans existed in a weird limbo. They weren't They were nationals, which meant they had some protections but couldn't vote in federal elections and had limited rights. It was the kind of awkward colonial arrangement that everyone pretended wasn't colonial. The Jones Act changed that by granting U.S. citizenship to anyone born in Puerto Rico. But here's the catch, and there's always a catch: it didn't grant statehood. Puerto Ricans were citizens, but their territory wasn't a state. They could be drafted, but they couldn't vote for president. They had some self-governance, but ultimately answered to Congress, which could override Puerto Rican laws and wasn't accountable to Puerto Rican voters. The citizenship provision passed without much debate in Congress, overshadowed by war preparations. Some Puerto Rican leaders supported it, seeing it as progress toward eventual statehood. Others opposed it, wanting either full statehood or independence rather than this middle status. About 288 people in Puerto Rico declined U.S. citizenship, which was their right under the Act, but the vast majority became citizens by default. That citizenship clause created a relationship that's lasted over a century now. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, serve in the military at high rates, pay most federal taxes, but can't vote for president unless they move to a state. It's citizenship with asterisks, granted in 1917 for practical wartime reasons and never fully resolved since. Every debate about Puerto Rican statehood, every discussion of territorial status, every hurricane response that's been inadequate, it all traces back to that 1917 act that granted citizenship without equality. The Jones Act set up a permanent ambiguity, a quiet decision that shaped millions of lives while maintaining a colonial relationship everyone agreed to not call colonial. And that ambiguity has defined Puerto Rico's status ever since. Speaking of quiet decisions about who belongs in America, immigration policy was about to get very specific about exactly who was welcome. The Immigration Act quotas. Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924 on May 26th, and it quietly reshaped American demographics for the next 40 years by establishing national origin quotas that heavily favored Northern Europeans. The act didn't make headlines the way you'd expect something so consequential to, probably because restricting immigration was broadly popular at the time, which tells you something uncomfortable about 1920s America. The quota system worked like this. Each country got a quota equal to 2% of the number of people from that country already living in the United States, based on the 1990 census. But here's where it got really specific. The law used the 1890 census as the baseline, not a more recent one. And the 90 are forwarding Tepecate. Why 1890? By the 1920s, there'd been huge waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews fleeing persecution. Using the older census meant much smaller quotas for those groups. The math was deliberately designed to favor certain ethnicities. Britain got a huge quota, over 65,000 per year. Germany got about 25,000. Italy got less than 4,000. Poland got about 6,000. Asian immigration was essentially banned entirely through exclusion acts that were already in place. The act created a hierarchy of desirability that was about as subtle as a brick through a window. Congress passed it with broad bipartisan support, and Coolidge signed it without much ceremony. The eugenics movement was influential at the time, and there were widespread fears about immigrants from non-Nordic countries somehow diluting American culture or bloodlines. Reading the congressional debates now is uncomfortable. There's a lot of pseudo-scientific racism dressed up in policy language. But that was the intellectual climate of 1924. The quotas stayed in place until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 finally abolished them. For 41 years, American immigration policy explicitly preferred certain nationalities over others, shaped by a law signed quietly in the midst of the Roaring Twenties. The demographic consequences were profound. Immigration slowed dramatically, became less diverse, and the ethnic composition of America in the mid-20th century reflected those quotas. It's a reminder that immigration policy is never just about numbers. It's about who a country decides, belongs, who's welcome, and what vision of itself a nation chooses to pursue. And sometimes, those decisions are made quietly, signed into law without fanfare, and shape generations. But while the government was restricting who could enter the country, it was also beginning to consider how to help those already here, particularly during hard times. The Social Security Act framework. Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act on August 14th, 1935, creating the framework for America's social safety net. But here's something that often gets overlooked. The way the act was structured, specifically who it excluded, had consequences that shaped racial wealth inequality for generations, and those exclusions were quiet, bureaucratic, and devastating. The Social Security Act established old age benefits, unemployment insurance, and aid to dependent children. It was revolutionary legislation, creating the idea that the federal government had responsibility for economic security. But the initial framework excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers from coverage. On the surface, this might seem like a technical detail about which industries were included. In practice, it excluded about 65% of black workers in America. Why these exclusions? Officially, it was about administrative difficulty. Farm and domestic workers were harder to track, moved between employers, weren't always paid formal wages. That's the charitable explanation. The less charitable explanation is that Southern Democrats in Congress wouldn't support the bill unless it excluded these categories, because they wanted to maintain control over black labor in the South and didn't want the federal government providing economic security that might give black workers more leverage. Roosevelt needed Southern Democratic votes to pass the act, so these exclusions were quietly built into the framework. The bill passed Congress with significant support, and the signing ceremony emphasized the historic nature of old age benefits. The exclusions weren't mentioned much. They seemed like technical details in a bill that was otherwise transformative. But those technical details meant that millions of workers, disproportionately Black Americans, paid into a system during their working years but received no benefits. When white workers could retire with Social Security benefits and build some modest wealth to pass to children, excluded workers couldn't. The wealth gap that already existed got amplified by this differential access to social insurance. The exclusions were gradually eliminated. Agricultural and domestic workers were added to coverage in 1950 and 1954, but the damage was done. Decades of exclusion meant decades of lost benefits and lost opportunities to build wealth. Some economists estimate these exclusions contributed significantly to the persistent racial wealth gap we see today. The Social Security Act was genuinely transformative for those it covered. It lifted millions of elderly Americans out of poverty and created expectations about retirement security. But the framework it established, with its quiet exclusions, shows how policy design matters as much as policy intent. And speaking of frameworks that looked generous on paper but worked differently in practice, there was this one program for veterans: the GI Bill administration rules. Franklin Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill, on June 22, 1944, and it's often called one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history. It provided education benefits, home loans, and unemployment support to returning World War II veterans. But the way it was administered, particularly the home loan provisions, quietly created one of the largest racial wealth gaps in modern American history. The GI Bill itself was race-neutral in its language. Black veterans were theoretically eligible for the same benefits as white veterans. But here's where things got quietly devastating. The Veterans Administration let local banks administer the home loan program, and those banks could deny loans at their discretion. Redlining was legal. Restrictive covenants preventing black families from buying in certain neighborhoods were legal. Banks could simply refuse to give loans to black veterans. And they did. Systematically. The numbers are staggering. Of the roughly $67 billion in home loans guaranteed by the VA between 1944 and 1962, less than 2% went to non-white veterans. Black veterans were coming home from fighting fascism abroad and being denied the housing benefits that white veterans used to buy homes in new suburbs. Those homes appreciated in value over decades, became equity, could be borrowed against or passed to children. It was a massive transfer of wealth facilitated by government-backed loans, but only for white families. Education benefits had similar disparities. Many universities, particularly in the South, wouldn't admit black students. The GI Bill would have paid for their education, but if schools wouldn't accept them, the benefit was meaningless. Some black veterans went to historically black colleges, which were overcrowded and underfunded, trying to accommodate the influx. The VA's administration rules didn't explicitly say discriminate, but by delegating implementation to local institutions that did discriminate, the result was the same. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and created wealth gaps that persist generations later. White families used GI Bill home loans to buy houses that are now worth 10 or 20 times the original price. Black veterans often couldn't get those same loans. The GI Bill gets celebrated as this great success story, and for white veterans and their families, it genuinely was. It created the middle class, funded education, made homeownership accessible. But the administration rules the quiet decision to let local banks make the calls meant those benefits didn't flow equally. And just as one law was creating disparities, another would shift the balance of power in a completely different direction. The Taft-Hartley Union restrictions. Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over Harry Truman's veto on June 23, 1947, and it quietly shifted the balance of power between labor and management in ways we're still living with. Truman called it a slave labor bill and vetoed it passionately. But Congress overrode his veto with comfortable margins. The Senate vote was 68 to 25. Sometimes even being president isn't enough. The act came in response to a wave of strikes after World War II. During the war, unions had agreed to limit strikes to support the war effort. Once the war ended, they made up for lost time. 1946 saw the largest strike wave in American history. About 5 million workers walked out at various points. Congress, controlled by Republicans for the first time since the early 30s, decided to rein in union power. Taft-Hartley did several things that sounded reasonable but significantly weakened unions. It banned closed shops, workplaces, where you had to be a union member before being hired. It allowed states to pass right-to-work laws, prohibiting union shops altogether. It required union leaders to sign affidavits saying they weren't communists, which in the late 40s was basically a loyalty test. It gave presidents the power to order 80-day cooling-off periods for strikes in critical industries. It restricted unions' political activities and their ability to organize. The act passed with support from Republicans and conservative Democrats, over fierce opposition from unions and liberal Democrats. Truman's veto message warned it would reverse decades of progress in labor relations and give too much power to employers. Congress overrode him anyway, and the act became law without his signature, technically. The long-term effects were significant. Union membership as a percentage of the workforce peaked in the 1950s and has declined ever since. Right-to-work laws, enabled by Taft-Hartley, spread across many states, particularly in the South and West. The restrictions on organizing made it harder for unions to expand into new industries. The balance of power between workers and employers shifted, quietly but substantially. Labor historians debate how much Taft-Hartley contributed to union decline versus other factors like globalization and technological change. But there's no question the act weakened unions' position and changed what tactics they could use. It was a quiet turning point, passed over a presidential veto, that shaped labor relations for the rest of the 20th century. And speaking of quiet reactions to how things had been done, there was this constitutional amendment about presidential terms, the 22nd Amendment ratification. The 22nd Amendment was ratified on February 27, 1951, quietly imposing term limits on presidents that have bound every single one since. It was basically Congress's way of saying, we loved FDR, but that four-term thing was a bit much, and codifying in the Constitution what had been an informal tradition for 150 years. George Washington set the precedent by serving 2 terms and declining a third. Jefferson followed it. Madison followed it. And it became an unwritten rule that presidents served 2 terms, maximum. Theodore Roosevelt complicated things by serving most of McKinley's term after the assassination, then his own full term, then trying to run again in 1912, but even he acknowledged the tradition. It held until Franklin Roosevelt. FDR was elected 4 times, 1932, 36, 40, and 44. Which made sense, given the Depression and World War II, but also made a lot of people nervous about executive power. He died in office in 1945, early in his 4th term, and by that point, Congress was ready to make sure no one could do that again. Republicans, who'd watched Democrats control the White House for 16 years, were particularly motivated. The amendment's text is straightforward. No person can be elected president more than twice, and anyone who's served more than 2 years of someone else's term can only be elected once more. It was proposed by the Republican Congress in 1947 and ratified by the required 3/4 of states by 1951. Truman, who was president when it was ratified, was explicitly exempted. He could have run again in 1952 if he'd wanted to, but he chose not to. The 22nd Amendment has shaped presidential behavior ever since. Second-term presidents become lame ducks more quickly, knowing they can't run again. Some argue it weakens second-term presidents by removing electoral accountability. Others say it prevents consolidation of power and ensures regular turnover in leadership. Occasionally, a president will mention repealing it, but it's never gotten serious support. It was ratified quietly during the early Cold War, when everyone was focused on Korea and containment, but it fundamentally changed American executive power by ensuring that no matter how popular or effective a president is, they're done after 2 terms. Washington's tradition became constitutional law, all because FDR served 4 terms during national emergencies. But while the government was limiting how long presidents could serve, it was about to embark on a project that would literally reshape American geography. The Interstate Highway Act routing. Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act on June 29, 1956, authorizing 41,000 miles of interstate highways and fundamentally reshaping American cities and suburbs. But here's what often gets overlooked. The routing decisions, where those highways actually went, weren't just about efficient transportation. They systematically cut through and displaced minority neighborhoods, and those decisions were made quietly by state and local planners with federal money. Eisenhower wanted the interstate system for national defense. He'd seen the German Autobahn during World War II and understood how important good roads were for moving military equipment. The act authorized the largest public works project in history up to that point, with the federal government covering 90% of costs. It was sold as modernization, efficiency, and progress. Nobody talked much about whose neighborhoods would be demolished to make room. The routing process gave significant power to state highway departments and local planners, and they often chose to put highways through Black and Latino neighborhoods. Sometimes this was explicit racism. These communities had less political power to fight back. Sometimes it was framed as urban renewal. These neighborhoods were blighted anyway, supposedly. Sometimes it was simple economics. Land was cheaper where poorer people lived. Whatever the reasoning, the result was systematic. Highways cut through minority neighborhoods while routing around wealthier white areas. In city after city, the pattern repeated. Black neighborhoods that had been thriving communities got bisected by interstates. Businesses were destroyed. Neighbors cut off from each other. Property values tanked for homes near the highways. Pollution and noise concentrated in these areas. The highways enabled white flight to the suburbs by making commuting easier, while simultaneously destroying the urban neighborhoods white families were leaving. The numbers are hard to pin down precisely, but estimates suggest the interstate system displaced about 1 million people, disproportionately minorities. These weren't accidental impacts. Planners had maps. They knew where the highways would go. They made choices about routing, and those choices consistently put highways through neighborhoods that had the least political power to resist. The interstate system did make transportation more efficient. It did help the economy, but the routing decisions created a geography of inequality that persists today. Neighborhoods cut off from opportunity, communities divided by concrete barriers, exposure to pollution and noise concentrated in the places that could least afford it, and these were quiet administrative decisions, made by state and local planners, funded by federal money, without much national attention. It's a case study in how infrastructure isn't neutral, where you build things determines who benefits and who bears the costs. But while highways were reshaping physical America, immigration policy was about to reshape it in a different way entirely. The Hart-celler family reunification priority. Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 on October 3rd, standing at the base of the Statue of Liberty for dramatic effect. The act abolished the national origin quotas from 1924, which was genuinely important and progressive. But there was this quiet provision about family reunification that nobody paid much attention to at the time, and it ended up completely transforming American immigration patterns in ways Johnson probably didn't anticipate. The act established a new preference system for immigration. Citizen or permanent resident. You could sponsor relatives, spouses, children, and parents of citizens got first priority. Siblings got lower priority, but were still in the preference system. The idea was to keep families together, which sounds nice and humane, and probably tested well with focus groups. But here's what happened. This created what's called chain migration, though that term is contentious, so let's just call it family-based immigration patterns. One person comes to America, becomes a citizen, sponsors their spouse and children. Those people eventually become citizens, sponsor their parents and siblings. Those siblings sponsor their spouses and children, and so on. Each link in the chain enables the next one. Johnson and Congress didn't think this would dramatically change American demographics. They explicitly said the act wouldn't lead to mass immigration from Asia or Latin America. Hart-celler, one of the sponsors, said the notion of large-scale Asian immigration was without basis in fact. They were focused on ending the discriminatory quota system, not on how the replacement system would actually function. They were wrong. Family reunification became the primary path for legal immigration, and the source countries shifted dramatically. By the 1990s, the majority of legal immigrants were coming from Asia and Latin America, and most were coming through family-based categories rather than employment or other criteria. The family reunification priority, that quiet clause that seemed secondary to ending quotas, became the driving force in American immigration policy. It diversified America significantly, which, depending on your perspective, is either the greatest benefit or biggest problem of the policy. But either way, it was largely unintended. They built in a mechanism that prioritized family ties, and that mechanism shaped immigration for the next 60 years. One quiet priority system, created with good intentions about family unity, fundamentally altered American demographics. And speaking of quiet amendments that changed things faster than anyone expected, there was this one about voting age. The 26th Amendment lowering voting age. The 26th Amendment was ratified on July 1, 1971, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, and it happened faster than any other constitutional amendment in American history, just over 3 months from proposal to ratification. It was a direct response to the Vietnam War and the fact that 18-year-olds could be drafted to fight but couldn't vote, which, even at the time, people recognized was kind of messed up. The slogan was simple: old enough to fight, old enough to vote, and it was hard to argue with the logic, especially as the war dragged on and casualties mounted. 18-year-olds were being sent to Vietnam, but they couldn't vote for or against the politicians sending them there. The inconsistency was glaring, and the youth activism of the late 60s and early 70s kept it in the public consciousness. Congress had actually lowered the voting age to 18 by statute in 1970. But the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could only do that for federal elections, not state and local ones. That created a confusing patchwork, different voting ages for different elections. So Congress proposed a constitutional amendment, which would apply uniformly to all elections. It passed the Senate unanimously 94-0 and the House with only 19 dissenting votes. That's about as bipartisan as anything gets in American politics. The states ratified it in record time. Ohio, New Jersey, and several others ratified it within days. By July, enough states had ratified it to make it law. The speed reflected both the logic of the argument and the political reality. Youth activism was significant. 18-year-olds were a large demographic about to get voting power, and nobody wanted to be on record against it. The immediate effect was to add about 11 million voters to the rolls, though young voter turnout has historically been lower than older age groups. The longer-term effect was to make politicians pay attention to issues that affected young people, at least theoretically. Every presidential campaign now has to consider how they'll appeal to 18 to 29-year-olds, which wasn't true before. The 26th Amendment passed quickly, with broad support, as a direct response to a specific injustice highlighted by war. It's one of the few examples of the constitutional amendment process working smoothly and rapidly, which shows what's possible when there's genuine consensus. But sometimes congressional action wasn't about expanding rights, sometimes it was about checking presidential power. The War Powers Resolution veto override. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over Richard Nixon's veto on November 7, 1973. And it was supposed to be this great check on presidential war-making power. The idea was beautiful. Presidents couldn't just send troops into hostilities without congressional authorization, and if they did, Congress could force them to withdraw. In practice, it's been about as effective as a strongly worded letter. But the attempt was there. The resolution came out of Vietnam, obviously. By 1973, America had been at war for years without a formal declaration, and people were reasonably wondering how that was constitutional. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had given Johnson broad authority, but that wasn't a declaration of war. It was Congress basically saying, do whatever you think is necessary, which, in hindsight, maybe wasn't their finest hour of constitutional deliberation. The War Powers Resolution tried to fix this. It said the president could send troops into hostilities only with congressional authorization, a declaration of war, or in response to an attack on the United States. If the president sent troops without authorization, they had to notify Congress within 48 hours and withdraw troops within 60 days, unless Congress authorized continued action. Congress could also force withdrawal at any time through concurrent resolution. Nixon vetoed it, calling it unconstitutional and impractical. Congress overrode his veto. The Senate voted 75 to 18, the House 284 to 135. It became law without Nixon's signature, which was becoming a theme for him at this point in his presidency. Here's the thing, though. Every president since Nixon, every single one, has questioned the resolution's constitutionality. They've complied with the notification requirements, sort of, but they've all found ways around the withdrawal deadlines. Presidents have sent troops to Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Haiti, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and numerous other places, and the 60-day clock has rarely been enforced. Congress tends to authorize military action after the fact, or just not force the issue. The War Powers Resolution exists, it's law, but it's honored more in the breach than the observance. It's a check on executive power that presidents quietly ignore and Congress rarely enforces. The constitutional question of who has authority over war-making remains as unsettled as it was in 1973, just with more paperwork. But at least they tried. That's something. And speaking of trying to rein in executive power, Watergate would inspire another round of reforms, these ones about money. The Federal Election Campaign Act limits. Congress passed amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1974, right after Watergate, when everyone was feeling particularly virtuous about campaign finance reform. The amendments established contribution limits, spending limits, disclosure requirements, and created the Federal Election Commission to enforce it all. It was supposed to get money out of politics. Instead, it invented entirely new ways for money to flow in. The post-Watergate climate made reform inevitable. Nixon's re-election campaign had collected massive amounts of cash, much of it illegally, and Watergate had revealed all sorts of shady fundraising practices. Congress wanted to look like they were doing something, and genuinely, many members wanted actual reform. The resulting law set individual contribution limits of $1,000 per candidate per election and $5,000 for political action committees. It also tried to limit spending. Campaigns couldn't spend more than certain amounts on presidential races, and crucially, it created the public financing system for presidential campaigns, where candidates could receive federal funds if they agreed to spending limits. This seemed revolutionary at the time. Like maybe we'd actually reduce the role of money in politics. The Supreme Court had other ideas. In Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, they upheld contribution limits, but struck down spending limits as violations of free speech. The logic was that spending money on political speech is itself speech, and you can't limit speech. You can limit direct contributions to candidates, that's about preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption. But you can't stop someone from spending unlimited money independently to support a candidate. This created a system where direct contributions are capped but independent expenditures are unlimited, which opened the door to political action committees and eventually super PACs. The contribution limits stayed. They've been adjusted for inflation over the years, but the spending side of the equation just moved to organizations that technically weren't coordinating with campaigns, wink wink. The Federal Election Commission that was created has been chronically underfunded and often gridlocked by design. It has 6 members, evenly split by party, so tied votes mean no enforcement. The public financing system worked for a while, but presidents started opting out once they could raise more money privately, and by 2008, it was essentially dead. The 1974 amendments were a genuine attempt at reform during a moment of crisis. They created disclosure requirements that do give us visibility into political money, and the contribution limits do prevent some forms of direct quid pro quo corruption. But the overall effect was to reshape how money flows in politics rather than reduce it. Sometimes reform just creates new loopholes, and this was definitely one of those times. But while Congress was reforming campaign finance, they were also quietly creating another policy that would shape reproductive rights for decades. The Hyde Amendment rider. Congress first passed the Hyde Amendment in September of 1976, just 3 years after Roe v. Wade, and it quietly banned federal funding for most abortions. It's not a permanent law, it's a rider attached to the annual appropriations bill, which means Congress has to renew it every year, and they have. It's one of the most successful examples of death by 1,000 budget cuts. The amendment was named after Representative Henry Hyde from Illinois, who introduced it specifically to limit abortion access. After the Supreme Court legalized abortion in 1973, abortion opponents looked for other ways to restrict it, and limiting funding was the obvious path. If Medicaid won't pay for abortions, and Medicaid is how low-income women access health care, then you've effectively made abortion unavailable to poor women, even though it's technically legal. The original Hyde Amendment banned federal funding for abortion, except when the mother's life was endangered. The exceptions have varied over the years, sometimes including rape and incest, sometimes not, depending on which party controlled Congress and what compromises were reached during budget negotiations. But the basic structure has remained. No federal Medicaid funding for abortion in most circumstances. The practical effect is significant. About 40% of women of reproductive age are covered by Medicaid. For many of them, if Medicaid won't pay for an abortion, they can't afford one, even though it's constitutionally protected. Some states use their own funds to cover abortions for Medicaid recipients, but most don't. The Hyde Amendment doesn't technically ban abortion, it just makes it financially inaccessible for low-income women. The amendment has been challenged in courts, unsuccessfully. In Harris v. McRae, in 1980, the Supreme Court upheld it, ruling that the government doesn't have to fund a constitutional right and that the Hyde Amendment doesn't place an obstacle in the path of women seeking abortions. It just refuses to subsidize them. The distinction between refusing to fund something and actively obstructing it became important constitutional doctrine. Every year, the Hyde Amendment gets quietly renewed as part of appropriations bills that fund the entire government. Sometimes there's debate, but usually it's just understood that the votes aren't there to remove it. It's been in place for nearly 50 years now, renewed annually through Democratic and Republican administrations, shaping abortion access without technically changing the constitutional right itself. It's a case study in how funding restrictions can be more effective than legal bans, and how annual riders can create effectively permanent policy without going through the normal legislative process. And that quiet persistence has shaped reproductive health care for generations. But while domestic policy was getting contentious, foreign policy was about to get complicated in its own quiet way. The Taiwan Relations Act, Arms Clause. Jimmy Carter signed the Taiwan Relations Act on April 10, 1979, and buried in it was an arms sales clause that has defined America's relationship with Taiwan and China for over 40 years. The whole thing was a masterclass in diplomatic ambiguity. We'd recognize China, de-recognize Taiwan, but maintain unofficial relations and keep selling them weapons. It's the kind of policy that sounds completely contradictory until you realize ambiguity is sometimes the point. Context. The United States had recognized the Republic of China Taiwan as the legitimate government of all China since the communist victory in 1949. But by the 70s, that position was increasingly untenable. The People's Republic of China, the communist government on the mainland, clearly controlled China. They had 1 billion people and nuclear weapons. Taiwan had effective control over just Taiwan and some nearby islands. Pretending Taiwan governed all China was diplomatic fiction. Nixon and Kissinger had opened relations with China in the early 70s, and Carter decided to formalize recognition. On January 1, 1979, the United States recognized the People's Republic as the sole legal government of China and severed formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. This made China happy, but created a problem. We'd had a defense treaty with Taiwan, and now, we were abandoning it. The Taiwan Relations Act was Congress's response. It established unofficial relations through the American Institute in Taiwan, which technically wasn't an embassy but functionally was. And crucially, it included language about arms sales. The United States would provide Taiwan with defensive weapons to maintain its capacity for self-defense. Not offensive weapons, defensive ones, whatever that distinction means in practice. The act also said threats to Taiwan's security would be a matter of grave concern to the United States, without actually committing us to defend Taiwan militarily. It's deliberately vague. We might defend Taiwan, we might not. And that ambiguity is supposed to deter both Chinese aggression and Taiwanese independence declarations. It's called strategic ambiguity, and it's been American policy ever since. The arms sales provision has been the most contentious part. Every American administration has sold weapons to Taiwan under the act. And every time, China protests. It's a ritual. We announce arms sales. China condemns them as interference in internal affairs. We say we're following the Taiwan Relations Act. Nothing changes. Over 40 years, we've sold Taiwan tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons. The act created a framework that let America maintain the fiction of one China, while actually treating Taiwan as a separate entity worth arming and supporting. It's policy through deliberate contradiction, and somehow it's worked. Taiwan hasn't been invaded, hasn't declared independence, and American-Chinese relations haven't collapsed despite this ongoing irritant. Sometimes foreign policy is about finding a position everyone can live with, even if nobody likes it. And that's what the Taiwan Relations Act Arms Clause has been for over 4 decades. But while foreign policy was getting complicated, immigration policy was about to get even more so. The Immigration Reform Amnesty Rules. Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act on November 6, 1986, and the amnesty provision in it legalized about 3 million undocumented immigrants in what remains the largest legalization program in American history. Reagan called it amnesty, which would become a dirty word in later immigration debates, but at the time, it had bipartisan support and seemed like a reasonable compromise. Funny how that works. The act tried to do 2 things simultaneously: legalize people who were already here, and prevent future unauthorized immigration. The legalization part said that anyone who'd lived in the United States continuously since January 1, 1982, could apply for temporary resident status and eventually permanent residency. There was also a provision for agricultural workers who'd worked at least 90 days in the previous year. The enforcement part made it illegal to knowingly hire undocumented workers and required employers to verify work authorization. The theory was that if you removed the job magnet, unauthorized immigration would decrease. Employers faced fines and potentially criminal penalties for hiring undocumented workers, and they had to complete INEEN forms verifying employment eligibility. The legalization program was administered by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and it was massive. About 3 million people applied and were eventually legalized, roughly 2.7 million through the general provision and several 100,000 through the agricultural worker program. Processing all those applications took years. People had to prove continuous residence, which meant gathering utility bills, rent receipts, witness statements, any documentation showing they'd been here since '82. The enforcement side was less successful. Employer sanctions were rarely enforced. Fake documents became common. Unauthorized immigration didn't stop. It actually increased in the 90s and 2000s. Critics say the law sent a message that if you stay long enough, you'll eventually get amnesty, encouraging more unauthorized immigration. Supporters say the law would have worked if enforcement had been properly funded and implemented. Reagan's support for the legislation gets cited by people across the political spectrum. Immigration reform advocates point out that even Reagan understood the need for legalization. The act has become a Rorschach test. People see in it whatever lesson they want to draw about immigration policy. What's clear is that the '86 amnesty was a one-time event that wasn't repeated despite numerous attempts. Various comprehensive immigration reform bills have been proposed since, all including some path to legalization paired with enforcement, and all have failed. The Immigration Reform and Control Act remains the last major legalization, and its mixed results have made both parties cautious about trying again. But while immigration policy was struggling with enforcement, Disability rights were about to get a landmark law, the Americans with Disabilities Act scope. George H. W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act on July 26, 1990, and it quietly mandated accessibility in ways that transformed American public life, probably more than any other civil rights law since the Civil Rights Act of '64. But the scope of what the law actually required, the detailed regulations about ramps and bathrooms and reasonable accommodations, that was all worked out quietly by federal agencies afterward. The ADA established that people with disabilities have the same civil rights as everyone else and can't be discriminated against in employment, public accommodations, transportation, telecommunications, or government services. That sounds straightforward until you realize what it means in practice. Every public building needed to be accessible. Every new construction had to meet accessibility standards. Employers had to provide reasonable accommodations. Public transit had to be accessible. It was a massive, unfunded mandate that would cost billions to implement. The law defined disability broadly: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities. This covered mobility impairments, blindness, deafness, cognitive disabilities, mental illness, and much more. The regulations spelled out specific requirements: curb cuts, accessible parking, wheelchair ramps, elevators, accessible bathrooms, TTY phones for the deaf, reasonable modifications to policies and practices. Businesses complained about costs, but the law had broad bipartisan support. Bush himself had family experience with disability, his son Neil had dyslexia, and he championed the law enthusiastically. The vote in Congress was overwhelming. The Senate passed it 76-8, the House 403-20. Conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats both supported it, which basically never happens. The implementation was the real challenge. The Justice Department and other agencies had to write detailed regulations explaining what reasonable accommodation meant, what undue hardship, exempted businesses from requirements, what counted as accessible. Small businesses got some exemptions if modifications would be too burdensome. Historic buildings got some flexibility. But broadly, American public spaces had to become accessible. Over the next decade, you started seeing ramps everywhere, handicapped parking spaces, accessible bathrooms, lowered counters, TTY capabilities. It became normal to see wheelchair users in public spaces in ways that hadn't been before, partly because they could actually access those spaces now. Employment discrimination against people with disabilities became illegal and actionable. The ADA wasn't perfect. Enforcement has been inconsistent. Some businesses found loopholes. Disabled advocates point out ongoing access problems. But it fundamentally changed the built environment and employment practices in ways that are now so normal we barely think about them. Curb cuts and accessible bathrooms weren't always there. They're there because of this 1990 law that quietly mandated them. And speaking of quiet laws that changed daily life, gun control advocates were about to get their first major legislative win in years. The Brady Bill background checks. Bill Clinton signed the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act on November 30th, 1993, establishing federal background checks for gun purchases, and it was named after James Brady, who'd been shot during the assassination attempt on Reagan in '81 and spent the rest of his life advocating for gun control. The bill passed after years of lobbying by Brady and his wife Sarah, and it created the system we still use today for background checks. The act required licensed gun dealers to conduct background checks before selling firearms. Initially, this was a 5-day waiting period for a manual background check. In '98, this was replaced by the Instant Background Check System, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, which checks federal and state databases to verify that the buyer isn't prohibited from owning guns. Prohibited categories include convicted felons, fugitives, people convicted of domestic violence, people subject to restraining orders, people dishonorably discharged from the military, undocumented immigrants, people who've renounced citizenship, and people adjudicated as mentally incompetent. The Brady Bill had been stuck in Congress for years, blocked by opposition from the NRA and Republicans. It finally passed in '93 with a Democratic Congress and Clinton's support. The vote was close. The House passed it 238 to 189. It was hailed by gun control advocates as a major victory after decades of legislative defeats. The effects are debated. Since '94, the NICS system has blocked millions of gun purchases by prohibited persons, over 3 million as of recent counts. Gun control advocates say this has saved lives by keeping guns from criminals and domestic abusers. Gun rights advocates point out that the system only works for sales by licensed dealers. Private sales in many states don't require background checks, creating the gun show loophole. They also note that enforcement of laws against people who try to buy guns illegally is minimal. The Supreme Court upheld most of the law but struck down provisions that required local law enforcement to conduct the background checks, saying it violated state sovereignty. The federal government now runs the system directly in most states. The Brady bill established a framework that's still in place 30 years later. Every proposal to expand or modify gun background checks builds on this '93 law. It's one of the few gun control measures to become permanently embedded in federal law. Though debates about expanding it to cover private sales and gun shows continue endlessly. But while gun control was getting incremental progress, welfare reform was about to make a much bigger splash. The Welfare Reform Work Requirements. Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act on August 22, 1996, and it fundamentally restructured welfare by adding work requirements and time limits. Clinton had campaigned on ending welfare as we know it, and this bill passed by a Republican Congress and signed by a Democratic president did exactly that. It was controversial then, remains controversial now, and its effects are still debated 25 years later. The law replaced Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, the main cash welfare program with Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF. The difference was in the name. Temporary, not permanent. TANF imposed a 5-year lifetime limit on benefits and required recipients to work or participate in work activities within 2 years of receiving assistance. States got block grants and flexibility in how they administered the program, but the work requirements and time limits were mandatory. The theory was that welfare had created dependency, that guaranteed benefits discouraged work, and that requiring work and limiting time on assistance would push people towards self-sufficiency. Clinton argued it would break the cycle of poverty. Liberal Democrats worried it would push families deeper into poverty without adequate support systems. The Congressional Black Caucus largely opposed it. Republican welfare reformers loved it. The immediate effects were dramatic. Welfare caseloads dropped sharply by 2000. They'd fallen by more than half from their '94 peak. Employment among single mothers increased significantly. Poverty rates fell during the late '90s economic boom. Supporters declared victory. See, work requirements work. People just needed incentive. But the longer-term picture is more complicated. When the economy crashed in '08, many people who'd exhausted their lifetime limits had no safety net. TANF proved much less responsive to economic downturns than AFDC had been. The block grants to states stayed flat while need increased. Extreme poverty, people living on less than $2 a day, increased significantly after welfare reform. The work requirements also created their own problems. What counts as work? States have wide discretion, leading to inconsistent standards. Many recipients cycled between low-wage jobs and unemployment without escaping poverty. Single mothers, who were the primary recipients, faced challenges finding childcare and stable employment. Clinton's signing of welfare reform remains divisive. Some see it as necessary modernization that reduced dependency. Others see it as abandoning the poor in the name of political expedience. What's clear is that it shifted the American safety net from an entitlement to time-limited assistance tied to work requirements, and that shift has defined welfare policy since. And while welfare was being reformed, financial regulation was being quietly dismantled. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Bank deregulation. Bill Clinton signed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act on November 12, 1999, repealing key provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act and allowing commercial banks, investment banks, and insurance companies to consolidate. It was a quiet Friday signing that enabled the creation of financial supermarkets and, arguably, helped set the stage for the '08 financial crisis. Sometimes the most consequential deregulation happens with barely a headline. Glass-Steagall, passed in 1933 after the Depression, had separated commercial banking from investment banking. The idea was that banks that held deposits, regular people's savings, shouldn't be gambling with that money on risky investments. Keep boring banking separate from exciting banking. For 66 years, that separation had been law. By the 90s, the financial industry had been chipping away at Glass-Steagall through regulatory interpretations and limited exceptions. Citibank wanted to merge with Travelers Insurance and Securities firm, creating Citigroup, which would violate Glass-Steagall. They did it anyway, betting that Congress would change the law. They were right. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, named after its sponsors Phil Gramm, Jim Leach, and Thomas Bliley, allowed banks to offer commercial banking, investment banking, and insurance services under one roof. The argument was that American financial firms needed to compete globally with foreign institutions that weren't similarly restricted. The vote was bipartisan. The Senate passed it 90-8, the House 362-57. Some Democrats opposed it, including Senator Byron Dorgan, who predicted it would lead to massive taxpayer bailouts of banks within a decade. That prediction turned out to be disturbingly accurate. Senator Paul Wellstone voted against it, saying it would lead to fewer community banks and more concentration. Also, pretty accurate. But the momentum for deregulation was overwhelming. Clinton signed it, and the financial industry consolidated rapidly. Megabanks formed, combining commercial and investment banking with insurance. Banks got bigger, more complex, more interconnected, and harder to regulate. When the financial crisis hit in '08, these institutions were too big to fail. Critics blame Gramm-Leach-Bliley for enabling the crisis by allowing risky behavior and excessive concentration. Defenders say the crisis was caused by other factors: subprime mortgages, credit default swaps, regulatory failures, and that repealing Glass-Steagall wasn't the main culprit. The debate continues. What's undeniable is that the act reshaped American finance. It was bipartisan deregulation during a time of faith in markets and skepticism of regulation, and the consequences played out in the following decade. And speaking of consequential decisions that reshaped American politics, there was this Supreme Court ruling about campaign finance, the Citizens United corporate speech ruling. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Citizens United vs. Federal Election Commission on January 21, 2010, and it fundamentally altered campaign finance by ruling that corporations and unions could spend unlimited money on independent political expenditures. It was a 5-4 decision that got announced on a Thursday morning and immediately became one of the most controversial Supreme Court rulings in modern history. The case itself was about a documentary, Citizens United. A conservative nonprofit had made a film critical of Hillary Clinton and wanted to air it during the '08 primaries. The FEC said this violated campaign finance laws, prohibiting corporate-funded electioneering communications close to elections. Citizens United sued, arguing this violated their First Amendment rights. The court didn't just rule on the narrow question, holding that the government can't restrict independent political expenditures by corporations and unions because such spending is protected speech under the First Amendment. The logic was that speech doesn't lose First Amendment protection just because it comes from a corporate entity rather than an individual. The decision overturned previous precedents and parts of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law. It said corporations and unions could spend unlimited amounts supporting or opposing candidates as long as they didn't coordinate with the campaigns themselves. This opened the floodgates for super PACs, political action committees that can raise and spend unlimited money as long as they're independent of candidates. Justice Stevens wrote a scathing 90-page dissent, warning that the decision would corrupt democracy by allowing corporations to dominate elections with unlimited spending. The 4 liberal justices joined his dissent. The conservative majority said restrictions on corporate speech were censorship and that more speech makes democracy stronger, not weaker. The political reaction was immediate. Obama criticized the decision in his State of the Union address days later, with several justices sitting in the audience. Republicans largely defended it as a victory for free speech. Campaign finance reform advocates warned it would destroy limits on money in politics. In the years since, super PACs have become a dominant force in American elections. Spending has increased dramatically. A small number of very wealthy donors, sometimes giving through corporations or nonprofits, can effectively influence elections through unlimited spending. Whether this is free speech or corruption depends entirely on whom you ask. The Citizens United ruling was a 5-4 decision issued on a quiet January morning that reshaped American politics by equating money with speech and corporations with people. It's rarely mentioned without strong feelings on one side or the other, and its effects continue to shape every election. And that brings us to more recent history, where the decisions start to feel less settled and more contested. The DACA memo. Barack Obama issued a memorandum on June 15, 2012, creating Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals DACA, and it protected roughly 800,000 young, undocumented immigrants from deportation through executive action. It was a Friday announcement in the Rose Garden, and it happened because Congress had failed to pass the DREAM Act, despite years of trying. Sometimes when legislation fails, presidents use executive authority, and sometimes that creates controversies that last a decade. DACA applied to people who'd been brought to the United States as children, met certain criteria, arrived before age 16, lived here continuously since June 2007, were under 31 as of June 2012, were in school, or had graduated, or were veterans, and had no serious criminal record. If you qualified, you could apply for 2-year renewable protection from deportation and work authorization. It wasn't a path to citizenship or permanent legal status, just temporary protection that had to be renewed. The policy was created through prosecutorial discretion, essentially, the Department of Homeland Security deciding not to prioritize certain people for deportation. The legal theory was that immigration enforcement agencies have limited resources and can choose where to focus them, and that people brought here as children through no choice of their own shouldn't be the priority. It was policy, not law, created through an executive memo rather than legislation. Republican critics called it executive overreach and amnesty by another name. They argued Obama was essentially legislating through executive action, creating immigration policy that should come from Congress. Democratic supporters said it was a humane use of prosecutorial discretion to protect young people who'd grown up American in everything but legal status. The debate got heated and stayed that way. About 800,000 people applied and received DACA status over the following years. They could work legally, get driver's licenses, attend college in some states. Many had lived in uncertainty their whole lives, and DACA gave them temporary stability. Always temporary, always subject to renewal, always vulnerable to policy changes. Trump tried to end DACA in 2017. Several states sued to stop the termination. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in 2020 that the administration hadn't properly followed administrative procedures in ending it. DACA survived but remained vulnerable. It's still policy, not law, still subject to executive action or judicial challenges. The DACA memo represents both the power and the limits of executive action. Obama protected hundreds of thousands of people from deportation, but he couldn't give them permanent status. The policy has survived longer than anyone expected, but it's still temporary, still precarious, still waiting for Congress to act. And speaking of Supreme Court decisions that shaped Obama-era policy, there was this ruling about healthcare that came down to one word: the Affordable Care Act mandate upheld as tax. The Supreme Court issued its decision in National Federation of Independent Business versus Dollar Sebelius on June 28, 2012, and Chief Justice John Roberts saved the Affordable Care Act by calling the individual mandate a tax rather than a penalty. It was a 5-4 decision that came down to how you classified one provision, and Roberts' unexpected vote with the liberal justices preserved the signature achievement of Obama's presidency. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, had been passed in 2010 after a brutal legislative fight. It expanded Medicaid, created health insurance exchanges, prohibited insurers from denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions, and included an individual mandate requiring most Americans to have health insurance or pay a penalty. That mandate was the controversial part. Could Congress force people to buy insurance? Multiple states sued, arguing the mandate exceeded Congress's constitutional authority. The challengers said Congress couldn't use its Commerce Clause power to force people to engage in commerce by buying insurance. The Obama administration defended it as regulation of economic activity. Everyone eventually uses healthcare, so regulating health insurance was regulating commerce. The legal community expected the court to split along ideological lines. The 4 conservatives would vote to strike it down, the 4 liberals would uphold it, and Justice Kennedy would be the swing vote. Instead, Roberts joined the liberals in upholding the mandate, but not under the Commerce Clause. He said the mandate couldn't be justified as regulating commerce. Congress can't force people to buy things. But, he said, it could be justified under Congress's taxing power. The logic was that the penalty for not having insurance functioned like a tax. It was collected by the IRS, revenue went to the Treasury, and the amount was based on income. If Congress can impose taxes, and this functions as a tax, then it's constitutional. Roberts essentially said the court should interpret statutes to uphold them if possible, and interpreting the penalty as a tax made the mandate constitutional. The 4 conservative justices dissented, arguing the mandate couldn't be saved by calling it a tax when Congress had explicitly called it a penalty. The 4 liberal justices would have upheld it under the Commerce Clause. Roberts' reasoning satisfied nobody completely, but saved the law. The decision preserved the ACA's structure. Without the mandate, healthy people might not buy insurance, leaving only sick people in the insurance pools, causing prices to spiral, the death spiral everyone worried about. The mandate's survival meant the law could function mostly as designed. Years later, Congress reduced the penalty to 0, effectively eliminating the mandate. The court upheld the rest of the ACA anyway in a later case. But in 2012, Roberts' classification of the mandate as a tax was the narrow thread that preserved the entire law. Sometimes Supreme Court decisions come down to a single justice's vote, and sometimes they come down to a single word, tax versus penalty, and that word determines whether millions of people get health insurance. But while the court was deciding health care, it was also about to rule on another contentious social issue, the Obergefell marriage recognition. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Obergefell v. Hodges on June 26, 2015, ruling 5-4 that same-sex couples have a constitutional right to marry nationwide. Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion, and it effectively ended the state-by-state patchwork of marriage laws and made same-sex marriage legal everywhere. It was a Friday morning announcement that concluded decades of litigation and activism. Before Obergefell, marriage equality had been advancing state by state. Some states recognized same-sex marriage through legislation or ballot initiatives, others through court rulings. Some didn't recognize it at all. The result was legal. Chaos couples married in one state might not be married if they moved. The Defense of Marriage Act, passed in '96, had let states refuse to recognize same-sex marriages from other states, though the court had struck down DOMA's federal provisions in 2013. Obergefell consolidated cases from Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The question was whether the 14th Amendment required states to license same-sex marriages and recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. The challengers argued that marriage had always been between a man and a woman, that states should decide marriage policy, and that there was no constitutional right to same-sex marriage. Kennedy's majority opinion said marriage is a fundamental right, that denying this right to same-sex couples violated both the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses, and that the reasons for excluding same-sex couples' tradition, procreation, childrearing didn't justify the exclusion. He wrote about dignity and autonomy, about how marriage is central to personal liberty, about how excluding same-sex couples inflicted harm without legitimate justification. The 4 conservative justices each wrote dissents. Roberts argued the court was overriding democratic processes and creating constitutional rights out of thin air. Scalia called the opinion pretentious and egotistic. Thomas said it would harm religious liberty. Alito said it would lead to conflicts with freedom of conscience. The dissents were sharp, personal, and predicted ongoing cultural conflicts. The decision was announced on the same day the court term ended, which is traditional for major controversial cases. Celebrations erupted outside the Supreme Court. Obama had the White House lit in rainbow colors that evening. For supporters, it was the culmination of years of activism and the recognition that love is love. For opponents, it was judicial overreach and an assault on religious freedom and traditional values. The conflicts predicted in the dissents have indeed materialized: disputes about wedding vendors, religious exemptions, adoption agencies, bathroom policies, but the right to same-sex marriage itself has remained settled law, with even some former opponents accepting it as established precedent. Obergefell joined Brown v. Board and Roe v. Wade as one of those Supreme Court decisions that fundamentally altered American law and society, shifting what had been a contested issue in some states into a constitutional right everywhere. And while the court was expanding rights domestically, the president was making commitments internationally about climate change. The Paris Agreement entry rules. Barack Obama formally joined the United States to the Paris Agreement on September 3, 2016, committing America to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of a global climate accord. But here's the thing, he did it through executive action rather than submitting it as a treaty to the Senate. It's a case study in how executive agreements can shape policy quickly but remain vulnerable to political changes. The Paris Agreement had been negotiated at the climate conference in Paris in December 2015, with nearly 200 countries agreeing to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Each country submitted voluntary emission reduction targets, nationally determined contributions. The agreement created a framework for reporting and reviewing progress, but didn't impose binding emission limits or penalties for non-compliance. Obama joined through executive action, arguing it was an executive agreement rather than a treaty because it didn't create binding obligations requiring Senate ratification. This was legally debatable, but politically necessary. A Republican Senate wasn't going to ratify a climate treaty. The U.S. commitment was to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Environmental advocates celebrated it as historic international cooperation on climate change. Republicans criticized it as an unenforceable agreement that would hurt American industry while letting China and India, major emitters, off easier. The debate was predictably partisan, with views on climate change largely determining views on the Paris Agreement. Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2017, announcing we'd formally exit. The agreement's rules required a 3-year waiting period plus 1-year notice, so the U.S. didn't officially leave until November 2020, one day after the 2020 election. Biden rejoined on his first day in office in January 2021, making the U.S. part of the agreement again. This cycle, Obama joins, Trump withdraws, Biden rejoins, illustrates both the flexibility and fragility of executive agreements on major policy issues. Obama could join without Senate approval but couldn't bind future presidents. Climate policy whipsawed with elections, confusing international partners and making long-term planning difficult. The Paris Agreement continues, with or without consistent U.S. participation. Nearly every country remains part of it. The emission targets are voluntary and largely unmet by most countries. Whether it will actually limit warming remains very much in question. But the agreement represents the most comprehensive international effort on climate change, even if its effectiveness and enforceability remain uncertain. The entry rules: Obama used executive action rather than treaty-made, joining fast but withdrawal just as fast, turning climate policy into something that could change with every election. But while climate policy was being contested, criminal justice reform was about to achieve something unusual: bipartisan support. The First Step Act, sentencing reforms. Donald Trump signed the First Step Act on December 21, 2018, and it was the most significant federal criminal justice reform in a generation, reducing mandatory minimum sentences and expanding early release programs. It was a genuinely bipartisan achievement passed with support from both progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans, which, in 2018, made it practically a unicorn. The act did several things. It reduced mandatory minimums for drug offenses, particularly for nonviolent crimes. The three strikes provision, which had mandated life sentences for 3 drug convictions. The disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences, a ratio that had been 100-to-1 and was criticized as racially discriminatory, was effectively reduced further, and the changes were made retroactive so current prisoners could seek reduced sentences. It expanded earned time credits, allowing federal prisoners to earn more time off their sentences through good behavior and participation in programs like job training or education. It improved conditions for pregnant inmates and prohibited shackling during childbirth. It required prisoners be housed within 500 miles of their families when possible. These sound like basic humane practices, and it's telling they required legislation to mandate. The bipartisan coalition behind it was unusual. Progressive Democrats had wanted criminal justice reform for years, arguing the criminal justice system was racially biased and overly punitive. Conservative Republicans, particularly libertarian-leaning ones, had come to see mass incarceration as government overreach and a waste of taxpayer money. When Kim Kardashian visited Trump at the White House to advocate for clemency and reform, it became a cultural moment that drew attention. The bill passed the Senate 87-12 and the House 360-59. Trump signed it with a big ceremony, surrounded by supporters from across the political spectrum. It was hailed as proof that criminal justice reform could be bipartisan when framed correctly, saving money and reducing government power while also addressing racial disparities. The practical effects have been significant, but not revolutionary. About 3,000 federal prisoners have been released early under the First Step Act as of recent counts. Thousands more have received reduced sentences. The changes to mandatory minimums affect new cases going forward. But it's worth noting, this only applies to federal prisoners, who represent about 10% of incarcerated people in America. The vast majority are in state prisons, where these reforms don't apply. Critics say it didn't go far enough, that it was incremental when transformative change was needed. Supporters say incremental progress is better than no progress, and that the First Step Act showed reform is possible. Trump's signature on the bill remains his most significant domestic policy achievement for criminal justice, and one of the few major bills from his presidency that had genuine bipartisan support. And speaking of bipartisan support in response to crisis, there was this stimulus package during the pandemic, the CARES Act, stimulus checks. Donald Trump signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act on March 27, 2020. Just weeks into the pandemic lockdowns, and it included direct stimulus payments to Americans, $1,200 for most adults, $500 for children. The CARES Act was a $2 trillion emergency package, the largest economic relief bill in American history, passed almost unanimously because the economy was cratering and something had to be done immediately. The stimulus checks were the most visible part. If your income was below certain thresholds, $75,000 for individuals, $150,000 for couples, you got the full amount. Higher earners got reduced amounts, phasing out completely at $99,000 for individuals. The IRS deposited money directly into bank accounts if they had your information from tax returns or mailed checks otherwise. Within weeks, most Americans received money from the federal government, no application required. This was unprecedented in modern times. The government had sent rebate checks in 2008 during the financial crisis, but those were smaller and framed as tax rebates. The CARES Act payments were explicitly stimulus, get money to people so they can spend it and keep the economy from completely collapsing. The checks had Trump's signature printed on them, which was unusual and seen as either appropriate presidential branding or inappropriate political messaging depending on your perspective. The CARES Act did much more than stimulus checks. It expanded unemployment benefits by $600 per week, created the Paycheck Protection Program to help small businesses keep employees, provided funding for hospitals and vaccine development, suspended student loan payments, and imposed eviction moratoriums. It was a kitchen sink approach to economic crisis: throw money at everything and hope it prevents total collapse. The bill passed the Senate 96-0, and the House by voice vote essentially unanimous. In March 2020, with the stock market crashing and businesses closing, it passed in days. The usual debates about deficit spending and government intervention evaporated when faced with immediate economic catastrophe. The stimulus checks were popular across the political spectrum. Everyone likes getting money from the government, regardless of their usual views on government spending. Economists debated whether it was good policy. Some said direct payments were efficient stimulus. Others said the money should have been more targeted to those who lost jobs. But politically, it was effective. People remembered getting checks. Additional stimulus rounds followed: $600 in December 2020, $1,400 in March 2021. Under Biden, the direct payment approach, once used, became the template for pandemic relief. It redefined what crisis aid could look like and normalized the idea of federal government sending cash directly to citizens during emergencies. And that wasn't the only way pandemic relief would reshape American policy. The American Rescue Plan child credit expansion. Joe Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act on March 11, 2021, and buried in its provisions was a temporary expansion of the child tax credit that cut child poverty nearly in half during 2021. The expanded credit gave families up to $3,600 per child under 6 and $3,000 per older child, paid out in monthly installments rather than as a tax credit at the end of the year. It was one of the most effective anti-poverty programs in recent American history, and it lasted exactly 1 year. The previous child tax credit had been worth up to $2,000 per child, but only as a tax credit, meaning you got it when you filed taxes, and if you didn't earn enough to owe taxes, you might not get the full amount. Poor families often got less than the full credit, or nothing at all, which is backwards when the goal is helping children. The American Rescue Plan changed this temporarily for 2021. It increased the credit amount, made it fully refundable so families got it even if they didn't owe taxes, and crucially, paid it out in monthly installments up to $300 per month per young child. The monthly payments meant families had predictable income to cover immediate expenses rather than waiting for tax time. The mechanics were handled by the IRS, which isn't exactly set up for monthly benefit payments, but they made it work, depositing money into bank accounts monthly from July through December 2021. About 36 million families received the payments, covering about 61 million children. The effects were immediate and measurable. Child poverty fell dramatically, estimates vary, but somewhere around 40 to 50% reduction during the months the payments went out. Food insecurity among families with children dropped significantly. Parents used the money for basic necessities: food, housing, childcare, clothing. It was effectively a guaranteed income for families with children, though nobody used that phrase because it would have been politically toxic. The expansion was explicitly temporary, set to expire at the end of 2021 unless Congress extended it. Democrats tried to extend it as part of the Build Back Better legislation, but that bill stalled in the Senate. Joe Manchin, the key Democratic holdout, argued the expanded credit should include work requirements and that its cost was too high. The monthly payments stopped in December 2021, and child poverty increased again in 2022. Researchers documented the increase when payments stopped. Families struggled more. It was a natural experiment in what happens when you give families money and then take it away. The temporary expansion of the child credit showed that direct cash payments to families can significantly reduce child poverty quickly. It also showed the political challenges of making such programs permanent. They're expensive. They challenge assumptions about work requirements and means testing, and they require sustained political will that evaporated once the immediate pandemic crisis passed. But while the child credit was temporary, some infrastructure investments were designed to last. The Infrastructure Act funding allocation. Joe Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act on November 15, 2021, authorizing roughly $1 trillion for roads, bridges, broadband, water systems, and public transit. About $550 billion was new. Spending the rest was reauthorization of existing programs, but either way, it was the largest infrastructure investment in generations and one of the few major bipartisan accomplishments in an era of partisan gridlock. The bill did a lot. It allocated $110 billion for roads and bridges, $66 billion for passenger rail, $65 billion for broadband expansion, $55 billion for water infrastructure, including replacing lead pipes, $46 billion for climate resilience and extreme weather preparation, $39 billion for public transit, $25 billion for airports, and $17 billion for ports and waterways. There were also provisions for electric vehicle charging stations, grid modernization, and environmental remediation. The broadband provision was particularly significant for rural areas that still lacked reliable internet access, something the pandemic had highlighted as essential infrastructure. The water provision addressed communities like Flint, Michigan, that still had lead pipes decades after we knew lead was dangerous. The transit money addressed systems that had been underfunded for years and were literally falling apart. The bill passed the Senate 69-30 with 19 Republicans voting yes, a genuine bipartisan vote that's rare for major legislation. The House vote was narrower, 228-206, with 13 Republicans supporting it, despite opposition from Trump and some conservative activists. 6 progressive Democrats voted against it because it was separated from the larger Build Back Better social spending bill. Biden signed it in a ceremony at the White House with bipartisan attendance, though some Republican supporters skipped it for political reasons. The signing was framed as proving Washington could still function, that bipartisan infrastructure investment was possible even in a polarized era. The implementation has been slower than some hoped. Federal infrastructure money goes to states and localities, which have to plan projects, go through environmental reviews, award contracts, and actually build things. As of this writing, the money is flowing, but most projects are still in planning stages. The full effects won't be visible for years. Critics from the left say the bill didn't do enough on climate, and that infrastructure without addressing climate change is building for the past, not the future. Critics from the right say it's wasteful spending that will increase inflation and that states should fund their own infrastructure. Supporters say it's addressing decades of deferred maintenance and that infrastructure investment pays long-term economic dividends. The Infrastructure Act represents a traditional form of bipartisanship, Republicans and Democrats agreeing to spend federal money on physical infrastructure. It's the kind of bill that used to pass regularly but has become rare in an era of fiscal conservatism and partisan polarization. But while traditional infrastructure was getting bipartisan support, industrial policy was making a comeback. The CHIPS Act. Semiconductor subsidies. Joe Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act on August 9, 2022, authorizing $52 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. It was a quiet return to industrial policy, the government actively trying to shape what gets manufactured, where justified by national security concerns and competition with China. Sometimes global politics makes economic policy that would have been ideologically unacceptable suddenly pragmatic. Semiconductors, computer chips are in everything. Phones, cars, medical devices, weapons systems, everything that's electronic. And America had largely stopped manufacturing them domestically. Taiwan produced most of the world's advanced chips, with significant manufacturing also in South Korea, Japan, and China. The pandemic supply chain disruptions highlighted this vulnerability. Chip shortages caused auto plants to shut down and prices to spike. The strategic concern was Taiwan. If China invaded Taiwan, or blockaded it, America's supply of advanced semiconductors would be in serious jeopardy, which would affect both the economy and military capabilities. Semiconductors became recognized as a national security issue, not just an economic one. The CHIPS Act offered subsidies and tax credits to companies that build chip fabrication facilities, fabs, in the United States. It required companies receiving subsidies to not expand production in China for 10 years. It included funding for semiconductor research and workforce development. The goal was to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity in a critical industry. The bill passed with bipartisan support. The Senate voted 64-33, the House 243-187. Support came from both parties but wasn't universal. Some Republicans opposed it as corporate welfare and inappropriate government intervention in markets. Some progressives opposed it as giveaways to profitable companies without strong enough strings attached. But enough members of both parties saw it as necessary for competitiveness and security. Since passage, several major companies announced plans to build fabs in the United States. Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Samsung. These are multi-billion-dollar facilities that take years to build and require massive supply chains. Whether the subsidies will successfully rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing remains to be seen. The facilities are under construction, but production is years away. The CHIPS Act represents a shift in American economic policy away from pure free market approaches towards strategic industrial policy. For decades, the assumption was that markets would allocate resources efficiently and government shouldn't pick winners and losers. The CHIPS Act explicitly picks semiconductors as a strategic industry worth subsidizing, justified by national security and competition with China. It's a return to the kind of industrial policy America pursued in earlier eras. Government actively shaping what gets produced domestically, but reframed for an era of great power, competition, and supply chain vulnerability. Whether it succeeds in achieving its goals will take years to evaluate. And speaking of industrial policy, disguised as something else, there was this climate bill that was carefully marketed as something very different, the Inflation Reduction Act climate incentives. Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act on August 16, 2022, and despite its name, it was primarily a climate bill that represented the largest federal investment in clean energy in American history. The name was, deliberate polling showed people cared about inflation, not climate change. So Democrats called it inflation reduction and hoped nobody would notice it was mostly about climate. Sometimes marketing matters more than substance in politics. The act allocated about $370 billion for energy security and climate programs over 10 years. It included tax credits for electric vehicles, home energy efficiency improvements, and rooftop solar. It subsidized renewable energy production and domestic manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. It invested in carbon capture technology and climate-resilient agriculture. It was everything climate advocates had wanted packaged as deficit reduction and inflation control. The inflation reduction aspect was debatable. The bill raised some taxes, a 15% minimum tax on large corporations, increased IRS enforcement funding, which reduced the deficit modestly. Whether reducing the deficit by a few $100 billion over 10 years would actually reduce inflation was questionable, but it gave moderate Democrats political cover to support climate spending they might otherwise have opposed. The bill passed on party lines using budget reconciliation, which meant it only needed 50 Senate votes instead of 60 to bypass a filibuster. The Senate voted 51-50, with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. Every Democrat voted yes, every Republican voted no. The House passed it 220-207. It was the most significant climate legislation America had passed, but only barely made it through. The climate provisions used tax incentives rather than mandates, encouraging clean energy through subsidies rather than requiring it or pricing carbon. This market-based approach was necessary to get moderate Democratic votes, but meant the emission reductions depend on people actually using the incentives. Early estimates suggest it could reduce emissions by about 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, though that depends on implementation. The IRA also included Medicare negotiating drug prices and capping insulin costs at $35 for Medicare recipients, provisions that had nothing to do with climate or inflation but were popular and helped the bill pass. Kitchen sink legislation at its finest. Republicans criticized it as wasteful spending that wouldn't reduce inflation and would increase the deficit despite Democratic claims otherwise. Climate advocates celebrated it as historic investment, but noted it fell short of what scientists say is necessary to limit warming. Moderates defended it as the best that was politically possible. The Inflation Reduction Act represents climate policy succeeding politically by not emphasizing climate. Its industrial policy and tax incentives, packaged as inflation control, passed on party lines, investing in energy transition through subsidies rather than regulations. Whether it actually works both at reducing emissions and spurring clean energy manufacturing will determine its legacy. And that, right there, brings us to the present moment, where these quiet decisions of the past are still shaping debates about the future. And that brings us to the present moment, where all these quiet decisions, the fractions and the funding clauses, the executive memos, and the Supreme Court rulings made by one vote are still shaping debates about power, rights, money, and who gets to decide what America becomes next. So here's the thing to remember as you drift off. History isn't just made in the dramatic moments everyone photographs and remembers. It's made in the boring committee meetings, the budget negotiations, the administrative rules that nobody reads until they matter. It's made by people who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make a decision quietly, implement it efficiently, and let time do the rest. The next time someone tells you politics is all theater and noise, just remember that while everyone was watching the show, someone was rewriting the tax code, adjusting the decimal point on a spending bill, or issuing a memo that would quietly reshape a century. Sleep well, and maybe check what's buried in your local city council's agenda. You never know what's being decided while nobody's paying attention.